Jock Rankin, the last limb of the law. Stirling's most famous staff man, Jock Rankin, was the son of an Ayrshire executioner. Details of his life are sketchy. His fame relies on the popularity of Victorian historian William Drysdale's comic accounts of his love life. In the winter of 1760, Jock called upon a peculiar and rarely invoked privilege due to Stirling's executioner. He requested that the borough buy him a wife. This they did, and Jock was quickly wed to the Irish petty thief Tibby Cocker, detained at the time in the Tolbooth cells. Drysdale, a great comic storyteller, relates the argy-bargy of their cat and mouse marriage. One day, and that a Sabbath, a disturbance took place, and Jock, though an old man, determined to give his wife a thrashing. Tibby had the good fortune to elude him and took refuge in a neighbour's house. Returning to his dwelling, he seized a basin of cold soup, which he greedily drank, but it so happened that a chicken bone stuck in his throat and ultimately choked him. A villainous hangman choking to death. If it all sounds too ironic to be true, that's because it is. Stirling's Town Council minutes for the 2nd of February 1771 record that Rankin did not choke to death, but was banished from the borough for entertaining tinkers and vagabonds and having quarrels with them, to the great annoyance and nuisance of the neighbourhood. In the mid-19th century, Jock's former home in Hangman's Close had fallen into ruin and was used as a night shelter for drunkards and vagrants. Local parents, eager to discourage their children from venturing into the alleyway, drew on Drysdale's colourful accounts of the staff man's death, warning their offspring to avoid the gloomy high-walled huddle, lest they be set upon by Rankin's wraith. Hoping they might mistake the tramp's muttering and spluttering, but his spectres oft reported gagging growl. Thanks to their efforts, Master Rankin's legend endures to the present day, here at the Old Town Jail, and as the Happy Hangman, host of the popular Stirling Ghost Walk. The Hanged Man, Alan Mayer. Alan Mayer was an 84-year-old farmer from Candy End, and has the dubious distinction of being the oldest man to be executed in Great Britain during the whole of the 19th century, and the last man to be publicly hanged here in Stirling. A foul-tempered bully, he had beaten to death his wife of 30 years, Mary Fletcher, 86 years old herself, when she was murdered on the 14th of May, 1842. It had been 5 years since the last hanging at the Market Cross, and the hope of the penny-pinching bailies of Stirling was that the farmer's great age, combined with the dire conditions within the prison itself, recently declared the worst jail in Britain, would save the town the expense of hiring a hangman to end his life. On Wednesday, October the 4th, 1843, after 18 months' incarceration, he was carried to the scaffold. Too feeble to stand, he was tied to the stool on which he had sat to enjoy his final meal, and begged that he might be allowed to address the crowd. What followed was a terrible cacophony of abuse. The murderer's rant, though, was to be cut short, as the hangman pulled back the bolt securing the trapdoor beneath his stool, and he dropped. Still bound to the stool, the old man succeeded in freeing one hand, and snatched at the noose, preventing the rope from tightening. The crowd looked on in horror as the gasping grotesque twisted and turned until the hangman grabbed his ankles and pulled his legs until his neck snapped. Hastily dumped into a cheap pine box, he was buried beneath the new step then being laid by the Tolbooth entrance in Jail Wynd, and here he remained until his grave was uncovered during renovations by conservation architects Simpson and Brown in 2000. Scatters. Among other remains discovered during these renovations were those of poacher and cutpurse Alexander Miller, known to locals as Scatters. Sentenced to hang in Broad Street on the 8th of April 1837, this villain boasted that he would not die on the gallows. His grandmother, who he claimed to be a witch, had made a prophecy that he would die with his boots on. He unbuttoned his galoshes as he reached the jib and threw them into the crowd, sure that this would ensure his survival. it didn't. Poor Jamie. Teenage housebreaker John Campbell was a pitiful creature. Feeble-minded and easily led, his cries from the condemned cell on the top floor of the Tolbooth moved the locals to pity. The Baileys were petitioned to show mercy, but pity soon turned to scorn, as the cries from his cell arrested and annoyed the passengers on the streets, as the newspapers said at the day, and kept them awake night after night. They urged the court to bring forward his execution, and he was hanged on the 14th of May, 1824. Children in chains. Until the late 19th century, there was little difference between the punishments meted out to adults and children by Britain's courts. Mercy could occasionally be shown to younger felons, but it was often short-lived. On Christmas Eve, 1690, an unnamed waif was arrested by the town guard for stealing a pan containing cooked meat from a stall in the marketplace. Rather than being immediately whipped and banished from the borough, he was locked in the cell of the Tolbooth. Accounts show that 2 shillings was paid for bread and drink for the said child and a night in the prison. The poor homeless boy enjoyed a night's shelter and food in his belly. Well, it was Christmas after all, only to be thrown out into the cold and lonely winter wastes beyond the borough gate on Boxing Day. True confessions. People of all eras have demonstrated a passion for the grim and gritty details of true crime. In the 18th and 19th centuries, these ghoulish tastes were ably catered for in the pages of journals such as the Illustrated Police News and at public executions through single-sheet broadsides detailing the dastardly deeds, confessions, and repentance of executed felons. The account of debauchery and repentance, apparently given by 23-year-old burglar William Taylor, hanged in Stirling in 1790, is typical of these ghoulish mementos. It recounts with evangelical zeal his origin, born of honest and creditable parents who gave him an education suitable to their circumstances, and gave good and wholesome instruction, training him in the ways of virtue and religion. Then it gleefully regales the reader with lurid descriptions of his crimes. Finally, he confesses that his sins are more in number than the sand upon the seashore, and seeks God's mercy. That such confessions and dying declarations should seem rather more poetic than might be expected from an illiterate thug is no surprise. Most broadsides were the work of hack journalists who had no knowledge of the cases or criminals described, other than what had been heard in court. Everything else was made up, and loose ends neatly tied up. As Oscar Wilde would later say, the good ended happily, and the bad unhappily. That is what fiction means. Bailey Bird and the Black Bond. In 1773, a letter written around 1771 and quickly earning itself the title of the Black Bond was published in several Scottish newspapers. Stirling's lawmakers, it revealed, were amongst its very worst lawbreakers. Written by Bailies James Bird and Henry Jaffrey and Provost James Alexander, the letter detailed a pact between the three to secure for themselves the total management of the borough during their lifetimes, for the benefit of them and for their friends. Those seeking election to prominent positions paid for that privilege, and since only councillors in Stirling were legally entitled to vote in parliamentary elections, the Black Bondsmen arranged to sell their votes and those of others in their thrall to the highest bidder. The instigator of this plot was not, as you might expect, the leader of the council, Provost Alexander, a weak-willed man whose main claim to fame until this scandal was his ownership of a notoriously foul-mouthed cockatoo. Instead, it was his deputy, the formidable Bailey Bird, who took control, a man more feared than respected. Their corruption made public, Edinburgh's Court of Session declared that the whole council should be dismissed. Stirling's bailies could not be trusted to administer the laws of the land,